Welcome to part 10 of coding Slither.io in Python, and today I've decided to have mercy. This video is going to be really short. The only thing I'm going to be doing today is randomizing the textures for the snakes, because every snake, oh, and I already made a change, that's why it didn't run. We'll talk about that in a second. Every snake in the game has the same texture, body red.png, and I pulled up this file to show this. All the snakes are red, but in the game we want the player and the AI to be randomized, and maybe later we'll have the player be able to choose his texture, but for now we're going to randomize all the snakes. And this is something that's going to be really easy to do. This will be a very short video. But first, we need to reorganize our textures, which is something I've already done. So before, we had all our code here, and then a whole bunch of pictures were inside the code. Body red.png was one of them. There was red orb, purple orb, yellow orb. What I've done is I've moved those into a new textures directory, which now has all those. And this is something I should have done a while ago, considering it organizes our project much better. But to create a new file, all you do is right click on the project name, click new, directory, and then you can add the name. And then once you do that, you could just select the files, drag them over. It's really simple. Now, the reason there was this error at the beginning is because once you do that, once you move all the textures, our game will not run because all of these texture variables are now incorrect. So if I take bodyred.png as an example, this is the default texture for the player and all the AI and all the segments as well. Now this is when you pass this to pygame.image.load, I don't remember exactly where that happens, probably not in this file. When you pass this in as an argument to pygame.image.load, Pygame is going to look for this exact file in the directory of the file that launched that code. So more specifically, it's an object.py now that I think about it. So object is the parent class for player and AI and also snake. We talked about that previously. Here's the function I was talking about, pygame.image.load file path. So when we look for bodyred.png, it's going to start looking from the object file to all the other files in that same exact directory, and if it does not find it, we're going to get these errors. But if you want to modify the directory, which is what we did, we now have to specify the folder name, textures/bodyred.png. Now if I pass this in as the argument here for pygame.image.load, then the object file which runs that code will know to look inside this folder. And this is a really easy fix. So back to main game, I changed the player texture variable to textures/bodyred.png. And now in the textures list, I'm going to change all of these as well to simply add a textures/ so we get the right directory. So I'm going to copy and paste that for all of these. And I'm going to break up the line again because these are getting kind of long. And now what we should have is the exact same output as we had before, which we do. Now we got to actually randomize the textures for the player and the AI. This is going to be really easy to do. So when the player is created, actually let's start with the AI. That'll be easier. In the init function, this is where the AI are created in this for loop, I in range, the number of AI that we want. And right here, when we create the new AI, we pass in the random x, random y, dimensions, and then the player texture variable, which is bodyred.png. But instead, we want a random texture, so I'm going to create a variable for that. Random texture is equal to, and remember the choice function I mentioned in a previous video, random.choice. Choice will pick a random element of a list, which is really convenient for our purposes. Our list is self.textures, so random.choice will give you a random one of these file paths. So I'm going to pass in self.textures. And now, instead of the player texture, we are now going to use our random texture here for every AI. Now let me randomize the player texture. And this will be slightly different. So I actually got to change the order here. I can't say random.choice self.textures because I define the textures here, so I cannot pick a random item from textures when it hasn't been created yet. So I'm going to be really lazy, and instead of putting the player in the init function, I'm just going to move textures. So now that textures will be defined here, I can just say random.choice self.textures. And that will work just fine. It wouldn't work the other way because if textures was still down here, this would be undefined. And this should probably go in the init function, but for now it's just fine in the constructor. The player is still getting initialized. And notice this time I didn't use a variable, a temporary holding variable like this. I just put the random.choice self.textures directly in the player constructor, which works the same way. It's the same value. So now with that, if I run this, we're going to get a really interesting result. So indeed the player has a random texture. Let me run it again. The player texture is random, but watch what happens. As soon as I eat enough orbs, all the segments are still hard-coded to bodyred.png, which is kind of weird because this does not look very good. And I can't find any AI right now, but I already tested this previously. The AI get the same thing. So somewhere in our code, we're still hard coding the texture to be the red texture. So what I'm going to do, and I actually already looked to find where it was. It's actually in the snake file. So think about how this code works. We have well actually let me get the player to really demonstrate this as well. So I want player, segment, snake, and object. That's the last one. So let me move it here. Alright, so our player constructor wants a file path. It gives that file path to the snake. The snake gives that file path to the object, and the object uses that file path to store the texture. This is our hierarchy in our code here. The object has the texture. But the segments, if I look at the segments, they are still being hard-coded. If I look at snake, actually, not segment. So the snake will have the file path patched correctly, so the object gets the right file path, and the snake head will be the right color. But scroll down here and notice that whenever we create a new segment, this is inside of, I shouldn't just scroll randomly, the add segment function for the snake class. This is where we determine if the score has increased enough, and if so, add a new segment. Well, when we add the new segment, we still have textures bodyred.png here, and that is not correct. We need to have the random file path that we have here. But I can't put file path because it's not defined. So here's what I'm going to do. So in order to actually save this value for later, for when we create the segment, I'm going to create a new private variable for it. Self.texture path is equal to file path. And actually, this could be done inside the orb. It might make more sense. Let me do this same thing inside the orb, actually. So inside the orb, instead, I'm going to say, inside of here, self.texture path is equal to file path. So if any other object ever needs to access whatever file it was used to load its texture, all objects will have it. But back to my snake function, I just created a texture path variable which has that file path. Now I have something to work with when I create the new segment. So instead of creating the segment here, I can add self dot texture path like that. So now there's no longer this discrepancy between the file that we use for the snake head and the file we use for the segment. They are now the exact same. And in case my explanation was a little bad, let me just show you that process again. Main game, we have the player here. The player wants a random texture, so let's say it was the orange orb. And I am using the orb textures for the snakes, which is just fine by me because honestly it is just fine that way. I'm not going to make the orb textures any different from the snake textures, so I'll leave it as this is here. So let's say our random texture is the orange orb. Orange orb will get passed to the player constructor, and then the player constructor passes that orange orb to the super. Well, the super class is the snake, so the snake constructor gets the orange orb. The orange orb is passed to its superior class, which is object, and now object takes orange orb, stores it as a texture path variable, which is useful for us because now when we add a new segment in snake, we can grab onto that texture path variable and use it here. And our final result is we finally have randomized snake colors and all the segments are working correctly. But to make sure this is totally working, I will attempt to find an AI. I do this every single video. My AI are way too spread out. And so what you want to do, or if you ever want to change the size of the game map, you can totally do that. You just need to go to main game and then find where we initialize the AI here. And right now I'm saying that the AI can spawn anywhere between the negative width of the screen times 3 to the negative height of the screen times 3. So we're basically getting this map size way bigger than our actual screen. Instead of 3s, I'm going to change these to 2s. And I'm just going to do that for the snakes to make them closer together. I'm not really going to do that for the orbs. So I'm going to run this and hopefully I'll run into a snake. And I'm still not running into one, but that is fine. I know that the code is working, so thank you for watching. Again, this is going to be a really short one, and we are really close to finishing the game. In fact, I think the last thing I want to be adding would be a score GUI, since we don't currently have that. And also, we need eyes for the snake to follow where he's looking. But thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.